Yes, if Jesus made a lasagna, I would inhale that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas, here with my good friend Daniel, as always.
Yep.
How are you?
Doing well. Thank you.
Good. Well, welcome to another episode, folks. I'd like to begin by thanking our patrons over at patreon.com/reason together. They have decided to generously support this podcast so we can pay our editors who help us out with the website and the blog and the audio editing. So thank you to our patrons for doing that. If you'd like to join them and also enjoy some of the membership perks that they enjoy, you can go over to patreon.com/reason together and just pick a membership level over there. And we would be grateful. If not, you can keep listening for free. That's all fine and good too. Just be sure to share an episode with somebody.
There you go. Very good.
All right. Well, why don't we jump right in tonight? We have had some feedback from our last episode, and I thought we would address that first, and then we have an interesting listener question after that, and then we've got kind of a funny one for the after show, which, by the way, you'd have to be a patron to hear the after show. So shameless plug there. Anyway, let's start with the feedback that we have here.
Okay.
Last time we talked about the Exempla podcast and the Doyle's Fairies episode. Mm-hmm. And I know you had a chance to listen to that as well. Which, by the way, I don't know if you saw the host of that podcast reached out to us.
No, I didn't.
He did. Yep. And he was, I wish I could remember what he said now, but he was surprised to hear him mentioned on our podcast. And I guess somehow he found us because we were recommended as a, something else you might be interested in. When he was looking up his own podcast, he saw ours kind of referenced down below somewhere as another similar interest. So he started listening to that. And sure enough, he heard us mention him. So
good.
Hoping, I don't want to say too much, hoping that could lead somewhere here in the podcast world. Anyway, the Doyle's Fairies episode, we talked about that. I hope that you listeners, if you've listened to the last episode, had a chance to do the homework, I guess, and go listen to that. If you haven't listened to that episode, there's probably going to be some spoilers, I imagine, as we talk about this. Yeah. So you can pause now and go listen to the Exempla podcast, the Doyle's Fairies episode, and then come back to this point in our podcast and then listen here as we talk about it. Anyway, you're fresher on it than I am. I listened to it a couple weeks ago, I think now, and you listened to it today, right?
I did. Yep.
Okay. Why don't you start?
So basically, I believe it was 1930s. There was a girl who took her dad's camera back in the old days of cameras and took a picture with her sister, and she came back and said, "Dad, you gotta what do you go? Develop this." Mm-hmm. And he's developing it, and she says, "Oh, the fairies showed up in the picture." And so it showed one of the sisters was taking a picture of the other one of the sisters, and in front of her were these fairies supposedly dancing around or whatever. And so they took this as, whoa, how about this? What's this potentially supernatural phenomena or something? And so the mother went and spoke somewhere on it, and people of the Theosophical Society were deeply interested in that. And Arthur Conan Doyle, who was kind of in that group, really latched a hold of it and felt that he did some of his own research and was convinced that indeed these fairies were real. The girls were not denying it. They were saying that they were real.
Mm-hmm. And, like actual fairies. They believed these were real fairies showing up in the photograph.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And some people had their criticisms, so they looked too flat and the shadowing wasn't the same. Well, Arthur Conan Doyle, sort of provided a counter to that objection, and wrote an article on it, and I think even a book on it. And he was convinced, and well past his death, some I think 50 years later, into about, maybe was it the 1980s, maybe, that finally, as an elderly lady, this sister dropped the bombshell that it was a hoax, and her sister backed it up, and all these years they had said, that it was the real deal, that these really were fairies, and of course it sparks all of this debate: is there really fairies? And they caught the pictures, and is it real? Is it legit? And she drops the bombshell: no, it was a hoax. And people are saying, well, aren't you ashamed of yourself for doing this to people? And she said, no, they wanted to believe.
Yes.
We were having fun, and they believed because they wanted to believe. And so I think that was the host's point, was how do beliefs change? And he referenced Eve in Genesis chapter 3, changing a belief from what God had told them regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and what she wanted to believe. And so that was kind of the idea of the podcast, was taking that fairy story of people being duped because they wanted to be duped, despite some criticisms, and then saying, are we the same way? Do we have... Because each side looks at an issue and says, we have a cold, hard facts. And so both sides seem to be doing that. And so we believe something because we want to, or we don't believe it because we don't want to. At least that was the podcast host's take on it.
Yeah.
Did I summarize that about right?
Yeah, I think you summarized that quite well. And I do think that was his predominant theme, is sort of teaching a lesson through a story about why some people believe things that are false. And you hit the nail on the head, and by bringing up what that lady said, that they wanted to believe. Mm-hmm. And I think that really is sort of the driving feature of why people sometimes believe false things, is because they want to. But in discussing sort of that theme, I'm going to have to take it a step further, because I don't think that everyone believes false things just because they want to believe it. I think maybe the first people that believe the false thing do, but then subsequent people believe it just because everyone else does. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They might say, I don't really want to believe that fairies are a real thing. That seems weird to me, but look at all these people that, they claim it's real. And suddenly now you have generations of people that, believe false things or whatever, depending on what the thing is. Go ahead. I was going to say, it brought up some other possibilities of discussion here that are related to this, like real examples of this happening. So do you know who Nelson Mandela is?
A little bit. I mean, I'm aware that he was a political figure. Is it Nigeria, Nicaragua, or something? Was it?
Honestly, I couldn't tell you where.
Okay.
I think somewhere in Africa.
Okay.
And there's an entire effect named after him, because he died in the year 2013. Okay. If I remember right, I did some writing on him a while back.
The first president of South Africa and an anti-apartheid activist. That's what.
Okay. Thank you, Google.
NelsonMandela.org says.
Okay. But he died in 2013. And when the announcement came out that he had died, there was a lot of people that were surprised, because they assumed he had died in prison in the 1980s. Oh. And it's like large swaths of society believed that he had already been dead for 20, 30 years at this point.
Really?
Yes. So it became termed the Mandela effect. And that is the ability for people to believe false things simply because they heard it somewhere, and then it just gets repeated and repeated and repeated. Nobody ever actually verifies it. So I think that the lesson of believing something because you want to believe it, that's one half of the equation. The other half is people believe false things because they just assume everyone else is right. There's all sorts of examples of this if you think about it in our culture today. For example, if you swallow gum, what happens? Have you heard this?
I'm not for sure. Go ahead.
People used to say that if you swallow gum, it stays. I can't believe you've not heard this. If you eat gum, if you swallow your chewing gum, the notion is that it stays in your system for 7 years.
Oh, I've probably heard something like it, maybe.
Yeah.
But okay, 7
But
years.
do you know that that's completely false?
Sure.
It comes out exactly the same rate of speed as everything else you've eaten that day. Not to be too graphic, but that's just one thing. Or for example, that you lose most of your heat through the top of your head.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah, I heard at one point 40%.
Yeah, no, not true, unfortunately. Really? No, you lose heat throughout many parts of your body. It's not necessarily mostly through the top of your head.
We're not like walking chimneys.
No, we're certainly not walking chimneys, but I could see how people would come to that conclusion. Heat goes up and your head is up on your body. So that's where all the heat's going to come out because you're a walking chimney. Certainly not true. Or the idea that you only use 10% of your brain. Not true.
Really?
I mean, unless you have some sort of pathological condition or some traumatic injury to your brain. But if you've got a normal, healthy brain, you use all of it. It all functions for different things, and you use all of your brain. Or cracking your knuckles causes arthritis is another one. That isn't true either. But in fact, that one, I believed that one years ago. And those things have all been sort of debunked, but yet they still persist in society. And by the way, there are even doctors today that still believe some of these things and will tell their patients that. But false things persist because we just assume the rightness of other people, sometimes without really verifying things that are said.
I can't remember who it's attributed to. For some reason, I'm thinking Abraham Lincoln. Maybe I'm wrong, but if you say something long enough and loud enough, people will tend to believe it.
Yeah, maybe it's attributed to him, but I mean, I've heard it said too, like half the things on the internet are attributed to either Abraham Lincoln or Mark Twain. Yeah. So, right. but who knows who actually said that? But I remember even in my time in ministry in Connecticut, I would hear people say things that they just knew were in the Bible. Certainly, Pastor, cleanliness is next to godliness is in there somewhere.
Right.
Nope. No, it's not.
Yep.
Or money is the root of all evil. Right. Though this may be more of just a misquote than a false memory, but yet it's a falsehood that persists. It's actually the love of money that is the root of all evil. Or pride goes before a fall. A lot of people know that one. And that's actually not in there either. It's pride goes before destruction.
That's close.
Yeah. So there's all these things that get repeated. And by the way, our Baptist world is no different. We repeat false things too. Christians are not immune to this idea. And I remember, okay, I'm jumping from thing to thing here, but this just came to mind when I took a few classes in college years back. There was a paper I had to write on false memories. Okay. Do you know that it's really not difficult to take the average person and sit them down and remind them of that time that they were 3 years old and they were in a mall with their parents and they got separated from their parents and they were found by a man in a flannel shirt who picked them up and returned them to their family?
When it never happened, but then
when it never happened.
Yeah.
Right. And there's entire organizations that have been founded just for this purpose to examine witness testimony that has been used to convict people of crimes that they still insist they were innocent of. And they have actually gone back and found that people were able to create false memories because there was a pressure to be a witness, a pressure to be a certain thing or to see a certain thing. And they're like, well, I guess, maybe I did see that. And they affirm that they saw something that they didn't actually see because their mind is constructing it. False memories are a real thing that happens, and Christians are not immune to it either. And what happens is that when those things get repeated, when falsehoods get repeated, like Mandela died or what have you, everyone starts to assume, well, enough people are saying this, it has to be right. Mm-hmm. So you see, it becomes a problem real fast.
Sure. Yeah. To go back to the podcast, I thought as I listened to it, I couldn't quite put my finger on it exactly express a concern that I had. I felt like it was an oversimplification, maybe to say that that people just believe what they want to believe. People believe what they believe because they want to. Because there's a part of that that's willful. Now, I understand if you come to deception, you may believe it whether you want to or not, but sometimes when you're self-deceived, you can lead yourself into that error because you want it to be true, and finally you justify it long enough that you sort of convince yourself that it's true because you did want to. But as a swath, to say that people change their beliefs simply because they want to. One statement he made, and I thought he said, "I'm the same," or something like that. He said, "I laugh at Arthur Conan Doyle. When I read his book, how he was so convinced about these fairies that he believed them because he wanted to. But I'm the same because I don't believe them because I don't want to." Well, I feel like for myself, I'm like, no, I don't care whether there's fairies or not. I just don't think there are because it contradicts, or if they do, then they fit into my theological system. But it's not that I don't want fairies to exist, so I don't believe they exist. No, they just don't match up with what I have believed as given truth. You know what I mean? So it's not a want thing. It's so I think it's too much. If we were to project that over everybody, maybe that wasn't his point, where you started off earlier, and I thought you said it well, that some people change their beliefs because they want to believe something. Well, that's good because now you're paring it down. But if you just make it a generalization that we all change our beliefs because we want to, not really, I don't think. But
not all the time, no. But I think we're all susceptible to it.
Yeah, sure.
And for instance, if I were to ask you this question, hypothetically, don't answer it. This is just hypothetical. But if I said, Daniel, are there any things that you believe to be true simply because you want them to be true? I don't know that you could actually answer that question because really there is a self-deception involved when someone wants to believe something is true. They've convinced themselves that it's true, despite all of the evidence that they see. So they literally have blinders on. They can't see the forest for the trees. So if you were to ask them, is there anything you believe that you only believe because you want to? They would probably say, no, everything I believe is based in evidence. Well, hold on.
I think it's dispelled pretty easily, though. Especially with thinking people that are willing to consider even their own beliefs when you simply ask the question, why? So tell me what you believe about that. Why? What's your source of authority? Where do you get that? And if the next answer is, well, that's what I don't know. Well, then you really are just believing because you want to. And that is true of us, that a lot of what we believe is what's been told to us, and we want to believe that it's true. But other than it being told to us, we don't have the factual basis for it. And I think that's natural in life, that for every child, you indoctrinate them. You want to. You teach them something, but eventually you want them to go to the source and dig for themselves and become rooted into the source, not just your word for it. Even though you are telling them what is true, they need to go to the actual source of the truth, you know what I mean, and root down. Either way, they can believe, but one is more substantive than the other.
Yeah, and these can be large things, big theological matters, or they can be really simplistic things too.
Sure.
Like the vast majority of our brethren still to this day believe that helpmeet is a thing. Just from not understanding the usage of the word there, and yet it persists.
meet for him.
Yeah,
She's
a
a
helper
sufficient help.
appropriate for him.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, and it's like, it's persistent to the point where, whole books have been used with that word in the title.
Mm-hmm.
Even just the other day, I was listening to something where the pastor referred to the wife as a helpmeet. And it's like that. Okay. And that's why I say it doesn't have to be a major, huge theological issue. Sometimes it can just be the persistence of a misused word.
Sure.
Or misused phrase or an idea that people don't verify. It started out as a false thing that someone believed. And then it turned into something that everyone just repeated without ever verifying. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of scary because it makes you wonder how many of the things that we say could potentially be like that.
Yeah, right.
It really makes you think, right. And it's like, I got to do the work. I gotta look into this.
Right. Even as a young preacher, how much of what I'm saying is just repeating what I've been told or what I've heard, or have I studied that and done the research and can really land it?
There was, and maybe this hits a little close to home. When I was in Bible college for the short time that I was in it, there was a common sentiment because my brother was going to a different Bible college.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to the one that you went to.
Mm-hmm.
And when people found out that my brother went there, they would say things, oh, that Bible college, they're not local church only. I can't tell you how many times I heard people say that.
They're not local church.
They're not local church. Yeah, they're not local church.
Yeah.
And I just took it for granted that was true because so many people said it. Right. And I didn't find out till a good while later. Well, that wasn't true at all. Right. In fact, in a lot of ways, they were more local church.
Yeah, not in the way that they originally wanted to define it. But
right. Yeah. So it's like, and there's all sorts of issues that we could talk about that are just like that, where, boy, we come to find out later, man, I believed a false thing.
Yeah. Or, you said earlier, somebody says like they teach a false truth or something, whatever, however you said it. Well, sometimes it's even in, say, the illustration of the helpmeet or any one of 1,000 different things, that it's just an inaccuracy. It kind of, it plays off the real, and they're not even necessarily meaning to deceive, just maybe in some, in a level of ignorance, they say a certain statement, which later, if they were to say, right. Actually, I should say it this way, but they say it this way, and then it's repeated and repeated.
Right, but then why do the listeners just accept it? Why aren't they skeptical of it? Because they want it to be true. There's a part of them that doesn't want to question it. That
could be it, or they're just lazy.
Sounds right.
Sometimes, and I don't mean that as a pejorative against a bunch of people. I'm just saying that if we don't really want to do the homework, we like the guy, we trust the guy well enough, I'll just take him at his word.
Right. But I guess I'm kind of seeing those two things going hand in hand, the laziness aspect and the fact that they just want what they hear to be true, so they see no need to look into it any further. I see them kind of being two sides of the same coin, the laziness and the desire for what they heard to be true. That's a scary thing, but it really prompts you to want to do the work and, find good podcasts where they reason together about stuff.
Yeah, that's very good. Well done, Tom. So no, it is a good reminder, isn't it? That we need to be willing to, and I'm sure we've said it before, evaluate our beliefs. Truth will stand cross-examination. Now, we don't necessarily advocate becoming a skeptic of everything you've ever believed, and doing that overnight and casting it all out the window. But you should be willing to ask yourself the question, why do I believe that? And then if you can't give a good answer to it, start doing some homework, start asking some counsel. The men that have said that to you say, hey, I've always heard this, and I have to admit, I really don't know why. Can you help me? And if they can't, just keep following that trail, I guess. But
right. I was thinking about this the other day, not directly related to this conversation, but actually from a different conversation. And I guess it kind of applies. But it's like, we grow up, a lot of us in Christian homes, we hear the same things our whole life. And, we go off to Bible college, maybe we don't, but we go through that period and then we go off into ministry if we're called to ministry, and you could spend your entire life in ministry. does it seem sort of odd that someone could at 18, 19, 20 years old learn everything perfectly and interpret everything rightly and then never have to change what they believe ever again for the rest of their days?
Sure.
That seems not only odd, but in some cases it seems arrogant to me. That someone would suggest, I got it right years ago, and I just feel no need to ever question what I believe about that. That just seems kind of arrogant to me in some ways.
I think there's two sides to that. In one way, if you're accepting what has been passed down to you as orthodoxy from many generations, you might feel more bold to say, I'm repeating what, if you will, the forefathers have believed. This is orthodoxy. And though I haven't always studied it, though I haven't always known this prior to being 19 years old, I have been taught it now and I believe it, Okay, well, I can appreciate, I can even hear that same sentiment from Paul, that you accepted what I told you. Now, granted, Paul was an apostle and he was speaking sometimes by inspiration and things like that. But there is something to the traditions that have been passed down to you. And there's a reason why generation upon generation of men have believed these things. And, the conflict over the deity of Christ was fought in the first century, or first or second century. Those were fought a long time ago. But
and I'm not saying to question the Bible. I'm saying that it's wise for us to question our interpretation of things if we've always just taken it at someone else's word and not really looked into it ourselves.
Sure. And I agree with that too, to still say, even though it's orthodoxy, then I should step back and say, no, let's just make sure this is rooted here.
Right. And even orthodoxy, there is in a sense a flaw at the idea of just believing something because it's orthodoxy, because such is the nature of false memories and false things that over generations,
what is orthodox changes.
The truth kind of decays in a way, and it devolves into something that really wasn't orthodox. It wasn't there at the beginning. It's now some version of it that's a little tweaked and a little skewed, but everybody still says is the old paths, right? And I use that phrase deliberately, when really the old paths looked nothing like that. So all that to say, someone might tell you this is orthodoxy, and it might not be. You just have to do the work yourself.
Good. And maybe we could dive off into a conversation, but I don't want to right now necessarily. But how do you determine your source of authority? Because he said in the podcast, each side quotes cold hard facts. And to me, I say, well, yeah, but at a certain point, there ought to be a winner. You know what I'm saying? That one is approaching it more logically and has a case. And if there is no winner, then we're probably not talking about a bedrock truth.
Right. Well, sure. Well, and that implies that you're able to hear both sides. The issue is that many times one side of the argument is shuttered and already disabused from an entire group of people, so that they won't even consider listening to the other side. So they're just stuck in this constant feedback loop of the same information over and over again. They can't evaluate both sides, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, so this is not a new thing, but the concept that Calvinists don't evangelize. I used to believe that was true, and that's just not true. But it's because...
Not as a broad brush, right?
No. And it's because I was kind of in the same feedback loop of information where people just assume that's true. They repeat to each other that it's true. So we just all take it for granted that it's true. And it's really not. And that's just one example. And I forget where I was going with that. But all that to say, we do have to look into things ourselves, and we have to be able to evaluate both sides of the argument. And really the best way to allow someone to do that is let them see it all. Let them see it all. But I think oftentimes the spiritual leadership in our movement is more like, no, we have to hide that dangerous information from people. Well, I get that to an extent. if it's a young kid in your family and, they're very impressionable and you need to kind of shape them for a while. But when you're talking about Christians in a church, grown men and women, they have to be able to hear the merits of things, and evaluate it themselves. Otherwise, you just can end up with people in a bubble.
Mm-hmm. Let me go on to another question or feedback, and I claim responsibility for this one because I think I probably made a little bit bigger deal of it in another episode. But one writes in, both of you expressed dislike for gospel-centered ministry. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that concept means different things to different people, and that's absolutely true. Perhaps you could address that again in more depth sometime. So do you want to give a thought on that?
I do. Yeah, I do. And maybe it's partly my fault that I didn't really define what I meant by it. Or develop it when I talked about it. But, the question of how do you define what it means to be gospel-centered? Here's what I think, and this is my theory, okay? And try to prove me wrong. It's essentially a newer term.
Don't listen to Tom. I don't have to prove you wrong now. I just
okay, thanks. Down, yeah, argument over. I think it's essentially just a replacement phrase for a spiritual life or a godly life or a Christ-centered life. In fact, I think there are many who would call themselves gospel-centered who would affirm that it's the same as being Christ-centered in your life. So like the difference between a Christian who says he's a Christian and can repeat Christian things and sloganeer as a Christian, but their life doesn't seem anything like a Christian life. We would say maybe they're not a spirit-filled Christian. Mm-hmm. Whereas the gospel-centered person say, well, they're not a gospel-centered Christian because a gospel-centered Christian actually lives out what the gospel saved them for, right? But the reason why I tend to not like it, and I'm not against it, I tend to not like it because it's so ubiquitously used for just about everything. So like, you have a problem with, selfishness, what's the solution to that? Boy, just think about the gospel. Just be gospel centered. Okay. All right. So show me the connection here. It just seems sort of ambiguous and kind of frou-frou, kind of lofty in a way. And it doesn't really connect the dots very clearly with some things. You just can't take any problem in life and say, oh, just be gospel-centered and that'll fix it. Well, you have to tell me what you mean by that. And what it ultimately means is just be a spirit-filled Christian, right? But that's why I say it's a newer term that essentially replaces terms like spirit-filled or spiritual or godly and such.
For me, I would say that when it seems like they're drawing, and this may be one of a couple reasons why I don't care for it, but when I feel like you're drawing everything down to the gospel, I feel like you're carving a lot out of the picture. You're and it's not. I understand if you take gospel as a larger, God saved you to this. Well, okay, yeah, but technically the gospel is more talking about redemption, about reconciliation, about justification and things like that. And sure, if we think about those gospel truths, should it impact our life? Well, sure. But to say that everything should be centered on the gospel, I feel like, well, but what about discipleship and the glory of God? I mean, yeah, you can see that in the gospel, but I mean, at what point are we stuffing so much into the gospel concept and then calling it gospel? So yeah, I guess it just, to me, it's a little bit like you said, we're ubiquitous, but it's that what does the term really mean? And is it
right?
I'm not maybe so concerned about what you mean, but what it sounds like you mean. Well, if you can't convey it appropriately with the term, then I don't know that it's really valuable. So
right. Well, it would be like saying, so for instance, as a Christian, the gospel is part of the means, a major part of the means by which the Holy Spirit quickened me and gave me life, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm alive, you could say, spiritually because of the gospel. That would be a fair statement. But like physically, I'm alive, right? And my
Mm-hmm.
kids, when they have a struggle, I don't say to them, well, think about life. They get into a spat with each other. Boys, be life centered. Be life centered. They're they're having
Like
some
right.
temptation issue or spiritual problem. Boys, just be life centered. Be
Get your
life
mind
centered.
on life and
Yeah, it's
all that
just
it encompasses and means to you. Okay.
right.
Well,
It's just so nebulous as to almost be of little value. Whereas if I could say, you know what, be spirit filled, that's a little more on the nose. That
yes.
means there's some things involved in that. I've got to repent of some things, and I've got to ask the Lord for direction in this, and I've got to yield my will and yield myself to the Lord and ask Him to fill me once again with His Spirit and enable me to do the right thing. That's a little more direct and instructive and has actual teeth to it, some meat to
Mm-hmm.
it. Whereas to just say, just be gospel centered. It's like, what do you mean? Like,
Yeah.
tell
Well,
tell me something.
and to me, it caters to, or at least I fear, maybe this is why I sort of, it repels me a little bit, is that it seems to cater to a broad group of people that can agree on a minimal amount of doctrine. So, we all value the gospel, though honestly, I don't even know that we agree on the gospel.
Mm,
From place to place, what it actually is, or what a right presentation, or an accurate expression of it would be. But let's be gospel centered. Well, how about Bible centered? And let's talk about the whole counsel of God, and what
yeah,
about sanctification and holiness and purity and purified and
yeah.
zealous
Well,
of good works. Well, if you bunch all that up into gospel, well, okay.
sure,
But
and I understand your reason. I'm a little less on board with that reason for
mm,
rejecting the term gospel centered. Frankly, if I thought it was a useful term, I don't care who's using it or why. I'm going to use it too if I thought it was useful. So the fact that a broader evangelical movement uses the term gospel centered, I don't care. If I thought it was a good term, I'd use it too. Of course, then I'm going to get guns pointed at me from every direction by people saying, "Oh, you're an evangelical now because you use the term gospel centered." So what? If I just don't think it's very useful. That's
mm-hmm,
my reason
mm-hmm. Or
for
that
for
it's
kind of not liking it.
maybe not just useful, not accurate. Um, I mean, certainly
Well, I mean,
if I think
yeah,
of the gospel, will it help me? But should the gospel alone be the center of everything that I do? My gospel centered this, my gospel centered child rearing, and my gospel centered this, my gospel centered that. How about how
but I
about we
get it
pursue
though.
God and grow in truth and be sanctified and use
Yeah, but you
some more
can't do
words than explaining everything by gospel?
right. But I get it though because you can't do any of that had it not been for the gospel. I get it.
Right. It's a
I
starting
can
point.
see it. It's the starting point, right? So that part at least makes sense to me that you can't be sanctified without the gospel having been used to save your soul. You can't say no to a single sin today if it had not been for the gospel of Jesus Christ being utilized by the Holy Spirit of God to save your soul. Um,
Right. And there may
so
be
so
truth to that, but it's kind of limiting
yes,
too.
right. It's
Yep.
technically true, but it's in a sense almost backing up too far to deal with a present issue where there are terms in the Bible closer to my present issue than the gospel, if that makes sense. The gospel is a
Yes.
number of steps back. I'm dealing
Yes.
with terms like spirit filled, right? And, help me out here. Other terms that are closer to our present issue, yield yourselves, right? That's a
Mm-hmm.
good Bible phrase. Yield
Mm-hmm.
yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's closer to my present issue of sin than thinking about the gospel, which is how I got here in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I say it's more useful to me to think about those terms: spirit filled, yield
Right.
yourselves, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So,
But I'm okay if somebody wants to use it. I just want them to define what it is and really find a usefulness to it, not just ubiquitously say it as something we say. So.
Yeah, right. And the problem with that is that every time somebody says it, they're going to have to define it again, because how many definitions are there out there? So if you have to define it every time you say it, is it really a good term to use? Right. Maybe just find a different way to express it.
They're totally side tangent here, but there's another word exactly like that we use all the time in our movement. That's the word fundamentalism. Everyone who uses it defines it differently. And that's why it's like, at a certain point, can we just throw the word out? It's just kind of a useless word. Historically, it wasn't a good thing. It's confusing to people today. So anyway, I digress. I'm just thinking of other words like that, where it's like, why cumbereth at the ground? Just get rid of
it. That's a good biblical phrase you could have fun with.
I can't take credit for that, though. There's a book of the same title, really? Why Cumbereth at the Ground, and it is a book about fundamentalism in that sense, the usage of the word, and how historical fundamentalism wasn't everything people think it was today. Again, there's those false memories again, those things that get repeated. So anyway,
we are pretty close to no, actually. No. We got on right about on time. I know we had some technical difficulties, but so I think we're going to probably just tease our question and move into the after show, talking about Jesus and lasagna. And so
that is the weirdest thing.
Yeah, and that's not meant to be like sacrilegious or anything. But just it actually has an interesting question. It sounds corny at the outset, but it does bring up an interesting take that I think is fair to think about.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it does. And without giving away too much, I actually asked this question to my family. And I think it's an earnest question. I think the listener who asked it, I don't see any bad motives. I think it's an earnest question, and it does bring up a legitimate conversation. But I'll tell you what I said to my family, a phrase that never in all my life I could have imagined came out of my mouth. But I literally uttered the words, "Yes, if Jesus made a lasagna, I would inhale that."
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Again, I don't mean that to be disrespectful or irreverent. I hope you listeners will know us well enough by now that we're not trying to do that. There was a legitimate question asked. So if you want to hear it, though,
that's right.
Patreon.com/reason together.
And if you have any feedback about gospel-centered or Doyle's Fairies or lasagna, send it our way to reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. That's reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Or if you want to just send us a real lasagna, you can email that same address and ask for my physical mailing address, and I will gladly accept a lasagna shipped by FedEx.
That's right. Feel free to send that to Tom. Now, if you want to send me, a real lasagna, send me tickets home or something like that, and or to Italy. Have you ever had real Italian tomato sauce?
Well, I mean, my dad used to make tomato sauce, and he is a real Italian, so
he probably kind of has it like the recipe
technically
there.
Yes, I guess I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if his is like the best that's ever existed. Honestly, it's been a long time since I've had it, but I know he did make it a few times.
That's
and
neat.
He is a real Italian.
Did he make his own pasta?
No, I don't think so. I think he made gnocchi one time.
Yeah. Okay.
I think.
Neat.
Maybe that's a false memory.
False memory. Yeah, remember that time when your dad made you a gnocchi and real pasta sauce? Yeah. No, actually, he pulled it out of the bag when he got home from Walmart.
Yeah. My wife has made us real pasta though. That's
neat. That's neat.
That's a legit thing.
I recall being in Italy and noticing, this sauce is different. It was good. And then types of cheese. I remember our Italian missionary, making a big deal about we put this what is it Parmesan. He's like, I don't know what this American Parmesan non-cheese substance is or whatever that we're sprinkling on top of our pasta.
Yeah,
but he didn't have a very high regard of that.
Powdery. Yes, that you're talking about the powdery stuff that people eat. No, that stuff is horrible. It's like eating sawdust. Get yourself some real Parmesan cheese and put that on there. And I'll tell you, it drives me crazy when people say mozzarella. Okay, maybe that's overstating. It doesn't drive me crazy, but there is a part of me in my brain that goes, mozzarella.
Mozzarella. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. Any thoughts? Some things we need to bat around here, things you've been wondering about, or an angle of something we haven't seen and a question that we've dealt with, or a disagreement, send it our way. reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for being with us on this episode. We are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.